Bright lights, big crowds, Disney, a Tussauds, a Ripley's. This is a 42nd Street P.T. Barnum would approve of. And in fact, over 100 years ago, Barnum was doing all this and much more right here in Manhattan. Now New Yorkers only think of Barnum when the circus comes to town. But for a large part of the 19th century, he was one of the most celebrated figures in this city. And who can deny his spirit lives on?
Phineas Taylor Barnum was born in Bethel, Connecticut in 1810. In 1834, he moved his young family to Manhattan and began his relentless pursuit of fame and fortune. Right away, he displayed a genius for puffing up unknown or mediocre attractions into must-see spectacles. We call it marketing and promotion today.
I can't imagine how he would have manipulated the internet today. It would have been extraordinary. And people ask me, well, what would he be today? He would have been Disney, he would have been Donald Trump combined.
In his day, it was called humbug.
In 1835, P.T. Barnum, age 25, pulled off his first great humbug in Manhattan when he presented Joyce Heth in a building here near the corner of Broadway and Prince. Heth was an aged, infirmed African-American who'd been touring other cities as the 160-year-old nurse of Little George Washington.
With a blizzard of handbills, posters, and newspaper pieces he wrote himself, Barnum drew thousands of customers to Niblo's Garden to see Heth and hear her almost entirely fabricated story. Some came to be amazed, many others came to scoff. Most important for Barnum, they all paid the admission price. When Heth died the following year, he even sold tickets to her autopsy.
Since 1766, St. Paul's Chapel on Broadway has been one of the best known and most venerated landmarks in Lower Manhattan. For almost a quarter of a century in the 1800s, it shared this intersection with another extremely popular landmark. It was opposite the church, in more ways than one, where that office building now stands. P.T. Barnum's American Museum.
Barnum wasn't the church's most welcome neighbor. When the museum opened in 1841, he had covered the exterior with painted figures, gaudy banners, and flags, and lit it all up with a recent invention, limelight. He hired the worst musicians he could find to play on a balcony above the entrance, on the theory that their terrible noise would drive customers inside.
He upset the vestrymen of St. Paul's by stringing a rope across Broadway to a tree in the churchyard and hanging American flags across the street. When they complained, he publicly accused them of being unpatriotic.
Barnum filled the American Museum with a stupefying clutter of dioramas, scientific instruments, modern appliances, curious artifacts, an oyster bar, a rifle range, pretty baby contests, the Fiji mermaid, a menagerie of exotic animals that included beluga whales in an indoor aquarium, giants, midgets, bearded ladies, Chang and Eng the Siamese twins, Grizzly Adams trained bears, theatrical performances, and much more. In 1865, the museum staged its last spectacle when it burned to the ground in an enormous blaze. Barnum's vast collection was destroyed, the whales boiled in their tank, and exotic animals roamed Manhattan streets for days afterwards. Barnum quickly opened his new American Museum farther up Broadway, near Spring Street. It too burned to the ground in 1868, on a day so cold the water froze in the firemen's hoses. For weeks, passers-by gawked at the ruins encased in ice. Barnum humbugged the highbrow as well as the low. In 1850, he brought opera singer Jenny Lind, the Swedish Nightingale, to Manhattan for the start of an American tour. She gave her first concert at Castle Garden, now Castle Clinton in Battery Park. Built in the early 1800s as a harbor fortification, by 1850 it had been transformed into a large concert space. Neither Barnum nor anyone else in America had ever heard Miss Lind sing a note.
Jenny Lind's story is perhaps Barnum's single most extraordinary accomplishment because he took something that was absolutely nothing in American society and created a frenzy, created a mania, very much equivalent to today's rock stars, honestly.
For 6 months before her arrival, Barnum used every marketing and advertising means at his disposal to whip up a fever of Lindomania. He filled newspapers with stories of her beauty and piety. He ran Jenny Lind poetry contests. An entire merchandising industry sprang up to churn out Jenny Lind hats, Jenny Lind parasols, Jenny Lind face cream, and the Jenny Lind crib, which you can still buy today.
Jenny Lind decided to come to this country in September in 1850. She was on the steamer called the Atlantic, came into Canal Street, the harbor at Canal Street. Barnum had mastered such a marketing frenzy. There were 30,000 people downtown waiting for her to get off this boat. 30,000 people. It's amazing. Going up to the hotel where she was staying, it was another 20,000 people for the hotel.
Luckily for Barnum, Lind was a brilliant singer, and her tour was a huge success. Another of Barnum's greatest celebrities was the midget Charles Sherwood Stratton, whom Barnum christened General Tom Thumb. In 1863, Tom Thumb and the equally diminutive Lavinia Warren Bump, the Loving Lilliputians, were wed at Grace Episcopal Church on Broadway at East 10th Street. The fairy wedding, as Barnum promoted it, was the social event of the season.
The ceremony was actually here on this glorious altar. A little platform was created where they could step up and be seen. And as I said, it was by invitation only, and the list included the Vanderbilts, it included the Astors, General Burnside. The Civil War was happening during this time. This was a wonderful thing for people at that time, a deflection from the reality of the Civil War taking place.
On their honeymoon trip, the Loving Lilliputians were received by the Lincolns at the White House. In the 1870s, Barnum created the show for which he's best known today, the greatest show on earth.
People don't realize it, but this was his senior citizen hobby. He was already into his 60s. He had a lifetime of experiences and challenges, struggles and triumphs before the circus idea came to him.
In 1874, Barnum opened his circus at the Great Roman Hippodrome, a 10,000-seat arena he built catty-corner to Madison Square Park. That building would be succeeded by the first Madison Square Garden in 1879. The New York Life Building has stood on the site since 1925.
So what Barnum actually does is bring over a pageant that was popular in Europe that was called the Congress of Monarchs. And around the outer ring of the Hippodrome was this enormous, hundreds and hundreds of people in elaborate costumes, armor, headed by Napoleon, headed by the Queen of England, the Tsars of Russia. I mean, they were celebrating the monarchs of a society that we were really not looking to embrace. We needed to establish. Now, of course, it ended with big American flags and the Revolution.
It was at the Garden in 1882 that Barnum introduced Americans to his last superstar, Jumbo the Elephant, the matchless monarch of overshadowing and majestic presence. The Jumbo-mania Barnum whipped up was even greater than Lindomania had been. Jumbo's name entered the American vernacular as a synonym for really big. In 1885, Jumbo was killed in a railway accident while on tour with the circus in Canada. With typical ingenuity, Barnum had Jumbo's skeleton and hide separately mounted and toured both with his circus for a few years. The mounted hide went to the Natural History Museum of Tufts University, where it perished in a fire in 1975, and the skeleton to the American Museum of Natural History, where it was last on display in the 1990s. Barnum passed away in Bridgeport, Connecticut in 1891, asking what the circus's box office receipts were for the day. His circus would eventually be sold to Ringling Brothers, who still bring it to Madison Square Garden every year. On his death, no one disputed that Barnum had been the greatest showman and promoter who ever lived. the Prince of Humbugs.